morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Goreski, and I'll be your host for today. We have 1 week left in November, and that means it is the wrap-up of our November event. We had a theme this month for the very first time ever, looking at what was called Can You Dig It? We were looking at paleontology, archaeology, geology, really digging into our planet's past and what it can tell us about what was happening back then, and maybe even stuff about what could happen in the future. So that's been pretty cool. We still have a few more events to go to wrap up the month. So if you visit our website, exploringbytheseat.com, you can find all of those events that are coming up. There was a new newsletter that went out last night as well. So you should be able to find some of those events and then a sneak peek at December. We have a lot of really cool events coming up in December. So as always, we hope to see your classrooms joining us. So carrying on with that theme of Can You Dig It? We are going to spend a little time with Matt Bortz today. It's been a while since we've connected with Matt. He's a paleontologist who studies the evolution of animals in Africa. He is the curator of the Lemur Center's division of fossil primates. So this is at the Duke Lemur Center. He oversees 30,000 plus specimens, among them the world's largest and most important collection of early primates. These are pretty special fossils. They include things like skeletal specimens of extinct giant lemurs from Madagascar. They are really unmatched anywhere else in the world. So it's pretty cool that we get to spend a little bit of time with Matt today. So I'm going to reach in backstage and get him in here with me. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Good, good. It's good to see you. It's been a bit since we've connected.
It has. I'm really excited to be back. It's been too long.
Excellent. And I can imagine that in between that, you've spent some time out in the field doing some pretty cool stuff as well.
I have dug it. And have been out looking for all kinds of stuff to help connect us to our primate relatives.
Perfect. Great. Well, we have a great group of classrooms joining us today. We have some homeschool groups joining us as well. So we're going to turn them loose with questions soon. If you are tuning in via YouTube, don't be shy to give a shout out like our Tucson second graders just did in the chat. So let us know where you're tuning in from. Send your questions there as well. But for now, Matt, I'm going to let you take over for a little bit and take us into your world.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited that I get to be part of this month-long of learning about what we can find when we dig into the Earth's past. I'm going to start out with some slides to kind of show you where I've gone. Where I am right now, I should say, is in the museum at the Duke Lemur Center. And over my shoulder is one of my friends, Paleopropithecus. Paleopropithecus means the ancient shafak, which is a kind of lemur that's still alive in Madagascar. The shafak is still alive. And so then Paleopropithecus is named because it's a relative of shafak, which are the lemurs that like to bounce around on their back legs. And with that, I'm going to switch over to a presentation that'll show you a little bit more, including some of those shafak. So
all right, the big moment. We had a pretty good test call, so I imagine it's going to load up nicely for us.
Thank you.
All right, so far so good.
Okay.
Perfect. We're good to go, Matt.
We look good, Joe?
Yep, good to go.
Awesome. So, as many of you know, I am a paleontologist and have probably heard that word before and know what it means. But just in case, in science, we use lots of elaborate words to describe what we talk about. And usually those big, long words can be chopped into smaller pieces that tell us what we're really talking about. So a paleontologist, the first part, paleo, just means old. And then ologist gets tacked onto a lot of scientific disciplines because it's someone who studies something. And so paleontologist is someone that studies old things. And so this is a picture of a paleontologist that I've worked with who finds fossils by scuba diving for fossils in Madagascar. And so a paleontologist sometimes can be mixed up with an archaeologist, which is also someone who studies old things and likes to get things out of the ground. But what paleontologists specialize on studying is the remains of extinct or almost extinct life. Archaeologists focus just on human remains and the material things that humans create, things like art, things like pottery, things like clothing, stuff connected to humans. Paleontologists, we cast a wider net and are interested in anything that is left behind by life. And most of the things that are left behind are preserved as fossils. And so this kind of shows an example of a couple different ways that things can become fossilized. So in the upper left-hand corner, there is a shark tooth from an animal called Megalodon. That name means giant tooth because it had giant teeth. It was a giant shark. And the remains of this animal are found all over the world. It's really an incredible animal. And the reason why we find lots of Megalodon all over the world is because those teeth preserve really, really, really well. The teeth that are in your face right now are 95, 98% basically mineral or rock already. And so they fossilize pretty easily. And so a lot of the fossil record is really hard stuff, and especially things like teeth. Sometimes we find things like what's below Megalodon's tooth. We find skeletons and bones. Bones are also really dense, and so they preserve relatively well. They're not as dense as teeth, so the teeth tend to get preserved before the bones do. But sometimes we get bones, and very, very rarely do we get something like this beautiful skeleton of this ancient archosaur, or something like a dinosaur, or something like a primate. Other kinds of fossils we can find in the upper right-hand corner, that just looks like a picture of some rocks. But if you squint, there are some little impressions on the surface that are actually toe prints from a dinosaur that walked across what was once mud that then became solidified into stone. And so those trackways, those footprints, count as fossils. Those are part of the fossil record. And then that's all animals. Animals leave footprints. Animals have teeth. Animals have bones. Below that is a fossil of a plant. Plants also have an amazing fossil record that's really important because plants are made generally of things that break down even more quickly than bones and teeth. Plants are usually preserved in kind of special conditions. And so the people who study those are called paleobotanists, which means someone who studies ancient plants. And so paleontologists kind of spread out all over the world looking for the remains of ancient life in all of its forms that fossilize. And often those fossils make their way back to a museum. And so if you imagine a museum, this is kind of a scene from a museum of someone at our museum looking at a fossil collection that's on display. And a museum feels a little bit like walking into like an interactive classroom, or maybe a little bit like going into a really exciting scientific book where there's stuff on display and there's lots of words and videos telling you what's going on. And that's a really important part of what museums do, is we try to teach people about all the amazing discoveries that we're making about the fossil record. But the other thing that happens at museums is we have collections. We go behind the scenes where we have found more fossils than we could ever put on display. They would take up so much space, and we need to have such big museums to put them on display that we get a little more efficient about it, and we put them in collections behind the scenes. And so this is a picture of our museum behind the scenes. And later in this presentation, I actually want to show you what these look like in person. But this is kind of a picture of all of our drawers pulled out. You can see like there's little boxes on all of them. It's a little bit like going into a library where every box, every fossil has a number and has a drawer and a cabinet. So researchers and educators and students who come to our collection can pull out an individual specimen that was collected maybe 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, maybe last summer, and they can study it and make it part of their research project. And so that piece, the collections, are also a really important part of what museums do, along with having exhibits that invite everybody to come and learn. And so our museum is part of the Duke Lemur Center. And so the Lemur Center itself is a really amazing place because we have living lemurs. These are some of the animals that are living near Duke University in North Carolina. Things like a mongoose lemur, animals like this blue-eyed black lemur that are part of the diversity of lemurs that are found today in Madagascar. So these animals are now living in North Carolina in human-managed conditions with things like this cockerel shafak, which, as I mentioned, is an animal that loves to jump. And so here's part of a video of them in the forest leaping from tree to tree. And so these living lemurs at the Lemur Center are part of the story of ourselves. The lemurs are primates, just like us. And I'll explain a little bit more about what it means to be a primate. But part of the reason why the Lemur Center exists is because lemurs look a lot like some of the oldest primates that we find in the fossil record. So we have a Lemur Center because we're fascinated by lemurs on their own, but also because lemurs tell us a lot about ourselves. And the reason they tell us a lot about ourselves is because they look like fossils of some of the earliest primates we find that pop up in the fossil record soon after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So dinosaurs go extinct about 66 million years ago. And before that time is the Mesozoic era. The Mesozoic is made out of big chunks of time like the Triassic and Jurassic and Cretaceous. And then there's this mass extinction event where non-avian dinosaurs go extinct 66 million years ago. And then we enter the Cenozoic. And sometimes people call that the age of mammals. And part of how we recognize these big extinction events is paleontologists kind of spread across the world have gone out and collected fossils from rocks from each of these time periods. And we actually can recognize when we're in the Jurassic or the Cretaceous, depending on what kinds of dinosaurs we're finding or what kinds of shelled invertebrates we're finding in the rock layers from those time periods. And then things like non-avian dinosaurs drop away. And when we don't have non-avian dinosaurs, we know that we have entered Cenozoic rocks and we are dealing with the age of mammals, which also means the age of primates. And so when I go out looking for fossils, there's kind of like 3 questions I need to answer to figure out like where I even go to look for these things. There's an entire planet to explore. And so why do I focus on the places that I do? Well, I have to determine 3 things. I have to figure out what I'm looking for. What kinds of questions am I really interested in answering? And what fossils would help me answer those questions? Then I have to figure out what I'm looking for. When did it live? If I'm interested in non-avian dinosaurs, then I'm going to be looking in rocks that are from the Mesozoic era. If I'm interested in primates, I'm going to be looking in rocks from the Cenozoic era. And then I need to figure out where it lived. So if I'm interested again in primates, do I want to go to someplace like Antarctica to look for fossils of these things? Or do I want to go someplace like Africa to look for fossils of these things? And answering that question becomes kind of complicated and is something I want to invite you to learn how I do that. So to start with what we're looking for, one of the things that I do as a paleontologist is I try to find primate fossils. And so the question becomes like, what is a primate? How do I know when I have found a primate fossil? And the way I know if I found a primate fossil could be if I go out and I see an animal that loves climbing in trees, it's highly social, it makes really loud calls, it likes to eat fruit. These are all things that we see in the behavior of modern primates. But none of those things fossilize. None of those things are things that we would actually be able to see in the rock record. And so then we need to turn to other parts of our anatomy to figure out when we found a primate. And in turn, like, how do we know that we haven't found just like a really weird looking squirrel fossil? And the way we can answer that is by looking at the different parts of the skeleton that actually preserve in fossilized primates that we see in modern primates as well. A big part of being a paleontologist is actually doing research on living animals. I study things like living primates. That's why I'm at the Lemur Center. I study living lemurs as a way to understand what fossil lemur relatives are telling me. And so when I look at a modern lemur skull, there's a difference between the eyeball in a lemur that makes it different than a squirrel or a fox or really most other kinds of mammals. And this is something you can check on yourself too. And it's something that's found in all primates. It's a piece of bone that goes all the way around our eyeball. And so if you can see in this picture, there's kind of like this ring that goes all the way around the animal's eyeball where the lemur's eye would have been. And if you look at the squirrel, there's a little bit of bone from the top and there's some bone on the bottom, but then there's a gap behind that. And so if you kind of run your fingers very gently along the side of your head, you can feel that you have bone that goes all the way around your eye. That's something that tells us that your skull belongs to a primate. And that's also something that a lemur would be able to do. They can kind of touch here on their face and feel that they have bone next to their eyeball. Another thing that we can find in the fossil record that tells us we're dealing with a primate is by looking at hands. So on the hands of a primate, we have opposable thumbs. That's the ability to kind of take our thumb and swing it out and touch all of our other fingers. On the squirrel, you can see that its skeleton has a much, much shorter little thumb. It doesn't actually have the ability to touch that bone to anything. If you imagine if you have a friend or if you have a dog or a cat in your house, they also don't have thumbs. They don't have the ability to take their little, maybe dew claws, what we call like the little kind of nubbin of a thumb that dogs sometimes have on their leg. They can't touch that to anything. Whereas primates can do that. And the way that we can recognize that in the fossil record is the bones that actually let us kind of swing our thumb have an articulation that lets us see, oh, this is an animal that had a very mobile thumb that could have been used to touch its other fingers. At the very end of the fingers of primates, we have fingernails. And that's something that only primates have. So if you imagine the ends of a dog or a cat's paws, they have claws. A squirrel also has claws. Horses have hooves. And instead of those things, we have this stuff at the end of our fingers that really helps us have really broad fingerprints. And those broad fingerprints give us a really powerful grip that, among other things, helps us grab onto things like trees or to manipulate things like fruit and the vegetable stuff that we want to eat. And that's allowed by having these really wide fingers that are supported by really broad fingernails. And so we can see in the fossil record, if an animal has a really, really wide bone at the end of its finger, we know we're dealing with a primate if it has that. And then finally, within lemurs, there's some special adaptations that only lemurs have. One of them is on their lower teeth, they have something called a tooth comb, where they basically taken all the front teeth that they have and mush them together, and they're sticking directly forward. So when a lemur closes its mouth, instead of having its upper teeth and its lower teeth in the front of its mouth kind of clink against each other, its lower teeth just stick straight out of its face, and its upper teeth are kind of missing, like having something to touch on the lower side. And so we can see that tooth comb, that like fusion of all the front teeth, preserved in ancient lemurs. And so today, there are over 100 species of lemurs that live on the island and in the country of Madagascar. Madagascar is off the coast of Africa, and it is the home of lemurs. Another way to think about this is there are lemurs in Madagascar and no lemurs in mainland Africa, or really anywhere else on the planet except for Madagascar, or in places where lemurs from Madagascar are now in human management. So places like the Lemur Center, originally the lemurs that we have all trace their origins back to Madagascar. And so this is an ancient relative of lemurs. It's an animal called Smilodectes. And you can see it has a gripping thumb. It's grabbing onto that tree. You can see that it has bone going all the way around its eyeball. It's harder to see, but it has broad fingertips. So we know this is an animal that is a primate, and something that can maybe tell us a little bit about the origins of lemurs and maybe even the origins of primates. But the question is, where did Smilodectes come from? Where can we find more Smilodectes to understand how this fossil connects to us? So if we know what we're looking for something that has all those primate traits, something like Smilodectes. Now we need to know, when did it live? So again, we're looking mostly after the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. The reason we're interested in that time period is because paleontologists have been working on studying everything older than that time period, older than 66 million years ago, for 100 plus years, for almost 200 years now. And all of that stuff has been sorted through, looked at with a microscope. So far, no primates have been found in anything older than 66 million years. So we're looking at rocks that were deposited during the age of mammals to learn more about where primates come from. And then finally, we want to know where in the world to look for these amazing primate specimens. And where in the world also includes what kind of rock we're looking at. Fossils really are just kind of another type of geological structure. And so geologists and paleontologists work really closely together to try to understand where we can find fossils and how those fossils were preserved. There are three major classifications of rocks that geologists like to deal with. The first one is called igneous rock, and igneous means fire. And so these are rocks that are associated with volcanism, either from actual eruptions or from kind of the plumbing that helps to support a volcano on the surface. And so rocks formed in those conditions are not very good at preserving fossils, because anything from a living organism that gets preserved in an igneous rock is probably not going to last for very long. So we're not going to be looking at any igneous rocks from any time period, even from the Cenozoic. Metamorphic rocks are rocks that are changed in some way, usually changed through the application of lots of temperature and pressure. And so metamorphic rocks tend to form from the collisions of continents and mountain ranges. It's when massive geological structures are smashing into each other and warping the rocks within them. And if there are fossils preserved in the rocks in those metamorphic rocks, they tend not to preserve. They might have been preserved in the rocks initially, but once all that pressure and heat gets applied, often the fossils kind of like get mushed out of existence. And so metamorphic rocks are also not a great place to look for fossils. Finally, we have sedimentary rocks. And sedimentary rocks, those are great for finding fossils. Sedimentary rocks are usually formed from water, where material will be carried by water. And then once the energy of the water slows down enough for things like mud particles or sand grains or little bits of microorganisms to fall through the water column. They then accumulate in layers and layers and layers on the bottom of an ocean or a river or a stream. And those layers then become a place where if something dies that has a skeleton, or is a plant that has a structure like a stem or a seed or a flower, get preserved in those layers, and more stuff gets piled up on top, and you get this layer and layer of rock building on top. And as that layer of mud or sand gets thicker and thicker, the pressure starts to mount, and those layers get smushed together until finally we have these beautiful layers of material that kind of document what's going on in this water over the course of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. And so this is a picture of a sedimentary rock section. The stuff at the bottom is older than the stuff on top. As this layer of rock got preserved, you can see there's different kind of like sizes of rock within it because the environment that's depositing all of this rock is changing through time, and we might find different kinds of fossils throughout this section. So we're looking for sedimentary rocks from the age of mammals, and we're looking for things that have a postorbital bar, a ring around their eyeball, opposable thumbs, and flat fingernails. And this is a geological map of North America. One of the amazing things that geologists do is go all over the world and try to figure out what kind of rock and how old the rock is that is under their feet. And then we map that onto big and small maps to try to tell each other what we learned about what's under our feet. And what's really cool is we use similar color schemes whenever we make these kinds of maps. And so light and dark green is rock from the end of the age of dinosaurs. That's the Cretaceous era. And so looking at this map of North America, you can see this big band of green that kind of goes right through the middle of our map. That is where we find things like Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops. That is the Cretaceous rock that is forming that tells us about the age of dinosaurs. Then we use colors like yellow and tan to color in the age of mammals. And so you can see in that green, there's some tan and some kind of peach colored rock that is from the beginning of the age of mammals. And so that is one of the places that we target to look for ancient primates. Based on what paleontologists have observed so far about where we have found primates, we know that 50 million years ago, we have found rocks that are dated to about 50 million years ago produce primate fossils. Those primate fossils are mostly in the northern continents. Places like Europe and Asia and North America actually have some of the earliest lemur-like fossils that have ever been discovered. From 50 million years ago, we have no lemur-like or monkey-like things in South America or Africa. So the animals that are from the north eventually have to get into those continents. But if we want to know about the earliest part of the primate story, we want to focus on these northern continents. And one of the most spectacular places in the world to find these early primates is from the American West, in the state of Wyoming in particular. There are really, really spectacular fossils that reveal an amazing kind of lush, almost tropical world that was in the Rocky Mountains, essentially. And what we find are lemur-like primates like this Smilodectes, who's front and center eating some fruit, along with things like small, like terrier-sized horses and really strange kind of crocodile relatives. And all of those creatures can be discovered by going out and actually looking in these rocks. So now that I know where I'm going to find primates, what I'm looking for, where I'm looking for, I can actually now go out. And so each summer, I go out with a team of other paleontologists to look in what now is not a lush jungle, but is instead kind of the high altitude desert and badlands of Wyoming. And so you might be able to see my colleague, Paul, who's walking out there as a scale bar. And you can see these layers of rock. Again, this is all sedimentary rock, all rock that was put down by big river systems, basically flooding through this area. And in the muds and sands that we find that are basically broken down chunks of mountains. So behind me in this video are the Uinta Mountains. Those mountains are slowly breaking down and filling in the basin. That is, they're kind of like, as they get smaller and smaller into like sand grains and mud grains, we're filling in with layers and layers of sediment. And when you get up close to these layers, some of them are basically just like look like mud. So this is the surface of one of these buttes where we find fossils. And the fossils themselves are often sitting on the surface. We can see little bits and pieces exposed on the surface. This is the jaw of an ancient rodent relative. It would have been about the size of a groundhog. These are some of my other paleontologist colleagues, Doug and Madison, and they have found a primate along with our friend Alex. So Alex here has identified a primate skull that is preserved in the top layer of this chunk of sediment. So what you're looking at there is basically like the side of the brain case of this ancient primate. We found the brain case, and then at the other end, we found a little bit of ankle that was sticking up. And so because we had a little bit of the head and a little bit of the ankle, we thought we might have an entire skeleton preserved in this chunk of rock that we're crawling on top of. And so what we decided to do is, because primates are relatively small animals, instead of sitting down right there and trying to like dig them all out with dental equipment, the way that if we were dinosaur hunters, we might sit and kind of quarry for a little while. Instead, here what we do is we try to collect the rock that is surrounding the fossil and bring that whole block back to the lab. Because one of the things that can happen in Wyoming during the summer is you get really sudden thunderstorms or hailstorms that pop up. If you have a bunch of delicate fossils exposed on the surface that you're slowly digging out, they can get totally ruined by the rain and hail that comes through. So that big block that we just lifted out is something that we can actually bring back to the lab here in Durham. And eventually, inside that block is a creature called Smilodectes. Now, I'll introduce you to what that block looked like when we got it all the way back. So that's one place I go to look for fossils. Another one, because I'm at the Duke Lemur Center, is actually go to Madagascar to try to find the specimens of ancient lemurs and their relatives on the island of Madagascar. Here's a geological map of Madagascar. And again, you can see that there's this light green and dark green along the top kind of northwestern chunk of Madagascar. And because that's green, we know it's from the age of dinosaurs. So the first time that I went to Madagascar as a student, I was actually working with a group that was interested in dinosaur evolution. And so we trooped out to an area near the country or the city of Majunga in Madagascar, where the teeth of giant dinosaurs have been found. And so here, collecting the fossils looks a little bit different, where we're sitting in a quarry. We're creating pedestals. We're basically kind of like removing a bunch of rock. Then we cover the surfaces of that rock with plaster and then carry the blocks out. Again, finally removing all of the rest of the sediment, exposing all the bones when we get back to the fossil preparation lab. And creatures that have been discovered are things like Majungasaurus, which is this relatively small meat-eating dinosaur from Madagascar, or Mashikasaurus, which is kind of like a half human-sized creature that has really, really sharp little teeth. Some of them stick forward. It's almost like it has a tooth comb, kind of like a lemur. And a whole diversity of weird crocodile relatives, things like Ararapasuchus, which is like a wolf crossed with a crocodile, or Majungasuchus, which is like a toilet bowl crossed with a crocodile. And then finally, Semasuchus, which is actually a plant-eating crocodile. It's the only completely plant-eating crocodile that's ever been discovered. And it's only about the size of like a small dog, like a pug. And it's got these little leaf-shaped chomping teeth that would have used to eat plants. But if we're interested in looking for lemur fossils in Madagascar, those come from a very different part of the island. So looking back at our geological map, there's this blue color that goes from the north all the way along the west and down into the south. Those are all limestone deposits. And limestone is a type of rock that dissolves in water pretty easily. And so groundwater is often found flowing through these kinds of limestone deposits. That groundwater is flowing through basically underground caverns. And so when the erosion on the surface meets with the groundwater, you get a cave. Those caves become basically a sewer grate that's in the middle of the jungle, that then bones of creatures that are living on the surface get washed into these caves. And so we go into the caves looking for the remains of extinct lemurs. And so on the left is a picture of us first going into one of these caves. Sometimes the caves are skylight caves. So this is me in the center rappelling into one of these skylight caves, where at the bottom we find just like piles of bone. And so here's one of my Malagasy colleagues who is working inside of one of these caves, picking up little bits of bone from creatures that have been washed into one of these caves, telling us about what's been going on in this part of Madagascar, or right around that cave, over the last couple of thousand, maybe tens of thousands of years. And some of these caves are flooded. There's still water that is rising and falling within them. And so we work with scuba divers to go into the flooded caves, where they found things like this amazing skull of a creature called a horned crocodile, and also find lemur bones. So they bring up these containers of bones, still surrounded by water often, and we kind of make sure they dry out in a very delicate way. And we find things like modern lemur bones, things like ringtail lemurs and shafak are preserved because these fossils really aren't that old. Some of them are only a couple of 100 years old. But we also find amazing creatures like what I'm holding on the right. That is the leg bone of a giant gorilla-sized lemur that used to live in Madagascar called Megalatopus. And so here is some of the fossils that have come up from one of these submerged caves drying out for the first time. Some of these are lemurs, some of these are tenrecs, some of these are bats, lots of the different kinds of creatures that live in Madagascar. So this is what an artist named Carrie Whitman thinks that Megalatopus might have looked like, when these giant gorilla lemurs. And then here's a reconstruction of Paleopropithecus, the sloth lemur that's hanging behind me right now. And these animals they went extinct so recently that we find them next to fossils of the exact same species we have at the Lemur Center. We find them next to the remains of shafak, and we find them next to the remains of different kinds of common lemur, along with things like a horned crocodile and elephant birds, which is the biggest bird that's ever lived. It's a 12-foot tall bird that had a 2-gallon yolk, and I can show you an example of one of those specimens in just a little bit. But before I start showing you what's going on in the museum, I want to show you another piece of what we do with our fossils when we bring them back to the lab. We prepare them by scratching all the surface rock off, but we also put them inside 3D X-ray scanners called CT scanners. Those scanners let us look inside material that have different densities, so we can dissolve away the rock and look at the fossil inside. So in this block from Wyoming, we found this whole skeleton of an animal called Madagascar, kind of lurking inside this block of rock, where on the surface, we only could see a little bit of its skull and a little bit of its tail. Digitally, we can see what's going on inside. And what that lets us do is let us, identify what we're working with, this creature called Madagascar, which was a extinct relative of pangolins, which are these really amazing animals that eat social insects, things like termites and ants. And in order to get that animal out, we prepare it in the lab. So this is the fossil preparator, Carrie Whitman, who's also an artist who works in the lab and works in Madagascar, meticulously scratching away the rock using a tool called a using a microscribe. A microscribe is basically a hand jackhammer that over hours and hours and hours help her remove the rock, eventually exposing the fossils that are inside. And so this is the part of paleontology where a lot of work actually happens back at the museum. The part where we go out into the field to collect this stuff is usually only a couple of weeks. The stuff where we're removing the rock, where we're actually doing the research, figuring out what exactly we found and what it's called, all of that takes months and months and months. And so we go out during the summer to collect stuff and then do a lot of our work back here at the museum, eventually revealing what some of these animals look like. And so that is the end of what I would like to present to you. And now I would like to ask if any of you guys have any questions about what I've been talking about or about paleontology. And through that, I'll give you a little bit of a tour of of the place that I'm standing in.
Perfect. All right, Matt, thanks for that great presentation. Really describing where and how you find the fossils. The removal process was pretty cool to see as well. So it is a great job. You're not inside all the time. You're outside. You're finding cool things. But then you got to spend time getting it out and then looking at it, classifying it, preserving it so that other people, I imagine lots of people come and visit the collection, lots of paleontologists, primatologists, other folks to come and look and make comparisons.
Exactly. And it occurred to me that I should get the final product of what Madagascar looks like.
Sure. Yeah. Go for it. So if you do have questions, I see some in the chat already. You can put them in there. Here we go.
It's very nice cute little pangolin relative. So we got the whole thing. So the skull is here. Here's its arm bones. And again, part of paleontology is studying modern animals so we can figure out what they did. And so at the end of the elbow, so its hand is here, its elbow is here, there's this huge chunk of bone that is basically where the muscle that is on the back of your arm attaches. And in digging animals, that muscle is really, really powerful, so they can move dirt really powerfully. So we know that Metachiromes was a really powerful digger from that piece of evidence. So anyway, that is one of the most complete skeletons of Metachiromes has ever been found, which is really exciting.
Yeah, very cool. All right.
Okay.
Let's get into some questions. The first one I have here, this is from some second graders in Tucson. I'm going to ask a couple of their questions. I'm going to bring in some of our camera groups.
Great.
So Adave would like to know, today, alive, about how many lemur species are there?
There are about 100 species of lemurs today in Madagascar, and we think that about 16 have gone extinct. So Paleopropithecus is one of those. Megalatopus, here's the skull of Megalatopus, this gorilla-sized lemur. So we think about 16 have gone extinct. All the ones that have gone extinct are all big. They're all basically bigger than like small dog. And so that is part of what we're studying, is why the big ones went extinct and why we're left with the small ones, which are still amazing. And there's still 100 different species of them alive.
Okay. So one more question from them before I bring in some camera groups. The places you go to find your fossils, are they protected so only people like yourself can go, or can the general public get in there and collect as well?
That is a really good question. And it really depends on where you are. The best way to figure out what the rules are around collecting fossils in a place that you are is to go to the closest museum, the closest natural history museum or university where there's a paleontologist. Because some places you can go, like I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is kind of in the middle of North America, where there were like the entire city is just built on like miles of fossils. Like the rocks are just limestone filled with ancient coral reefs. And so like you couldn't build a house without disturbing and collecting a bunch of fossils in Cincinnati. And so those you can collect, no one cares. Like you just like have as many in your garage as you want. But there's some places like national monuments or the places where we go to look for these primates are on federally protected land where we need to get permits. So I need to write like an application that says like why I want to collect fossils and most importantly, how I'm going to take care of them. Because rare things, they want to know, does my museum have a lab where we can make sure they're stable? Do we have cabinets where we can keep them safe? So it really depends on what kind of fossils you're looking for and where you are. So if you do a little bit of research, though, you can find fossil clubs and museums that can help you look for fossils or join teams that have the right permits to go and look for fossils where you are.
All right, perfect. Well, we've got a mixture of homeschool students as well as elementary school students backstage. So I'm going to start in North Topsail Beach in North Carolina. We've got some homeschool action. I'm going to bring them in.
What?
Hey.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Very good. I was wondering what kinds of tools you use to get the fossils out.
So when we're in the field collecting fossils, we use things like hammers and mallets, and then we use plaster. So we basically have like bandages for like if someone broke their arm, we take those and wrap that around the fossils too to keep them protected. And now is a good time for me to walk down the hall. So this is the exhibit space I've been speaking to you from. But if you'll follow me down this way, I'll take you to the fossil prep lab, where we also keep some of our field equipment. So now I'm in the collection space. So this is where those cabinets are that are full of tens of thousands of specimens. We have a giant turtle shell right there and lots of maps surrounding us, including one, North Carolina, the Topsail out here.
Yeah, that's nice.
And so then here is our fossil preparation lab.
Oh,
and
wow.
So we have tools like, this is an air scribe. We have actually different kinds of air scribes depending on how much rock we want to move away. The big one obviously moves a lot of rock really quickly, and the small one moves just a little bit of rock. So that's what we use to actually kind of get the specimens out. And you can see this is a specimen of a monitor lizard. So it's a relative of things like Komodo dragons and savanna monitors. And you can see like these little scratches on the surface. Those scratches are caused by the air scribe that we're using to scrape the surface away. This is a fossil block that we haven't removed from its plaster jacket yet. And so to cut that open, we're going to use a saw. So that's another tool that we use. So there's a lot of kind of basic hand tools. We go to Home Depot a lot to look for it.
All right, cool. I think you have a second question in the chat. You want to go ahead and ask that one?
Yes. What was your favorite specimen that you found?
The favorite specimen that I found. I think I have two favorites. One was the first time that I went out to look for dinosaur fossils. I found a brow horn of Triceratops that was like 3.5 feet long, and it was just like laying on the surface. And that was something that, when I was really excited about dinosaurs when I was really young. But then I just thought that all the fossils had been found because the way we talk about them, we have names for everything. We present how long dinosaurs are, how much they weighed, all that kind of stuff. It feels like there's not a lot to contribute. So I kind of drifted away from paleontology. And it wasn't until college that I rediscovered that there were scientists who were still learning new things about the past. And so then I basically knocked on various professors' doors and asked them if I could help. And so one of them was going into the field and needed someone who was okay getting really sweaty. And so I did. And the first day that we went out, there's this Triceratops horn laying on the surface, and I just almost passed out because it was just such an exciting find. So that was one of the most exciting. The other, though, the reason that I talk so much about this Madagascar skeleton is because it is probably the most exciting thing that I've found. Is this this is just its skull separated from the rest of it. And it's one of the most complete skeletons of something that I've found out in the field. And it's a really amazing animal that sits right at the fork between pangolins go one way, and actually pangolins' closest relatives are dogs, cats, bears, and hyenas. Wow. And so this little Metachiromes sits right there at the split between those two groups. How do you have a pangolin and a hyena? What's the common ancestor of those two things look like? So finding that skeleton was a really, really exciting discovery.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very cool. Thanks, Matt. I'm going to go to Maine this time. We have some third graders hanging out with us today. How are we doing, third graders?
Hi.
Excellent. Do we have a couple questions for Matt?
We do. Go ahead.
Perfect.
How big was the biggest lemur?
What was the biggest lemur?
Yeah, how big was it?
Oh, how big? So here, I'll see if I can do this. Here it is as a skeleton, life size on our wall, and I'm gonna squat down next to it. So it is me sized, if not bigger. They probably weighed more than I do, so it would have been like a gorilla sized lemur. Paleopropithecus, I'll get a little closer so scale's easier. So here's my hand. So this is like a golden retriever, golden lab sized lemur. And there's other giant lemurs that we have. There's another one that we only have a few bones from an animal called Archaeoindri that we think would have been the size of a giant male gorilla, which is huge. That makes it basically one of the biggest primates ever. And what's really cool about that is there are also lemurs. The smallest primate in the world is this animal called a mouse lemur. And it comes by its name very honestly because it is the size of a mouse. That skull is smaller than a rat, size of a mouse. And so the smallest primate in the world is the mouse lemur. And then the biggest is a gorilla. But if extinct lemurs, are the size of gorillas, it means that lemurs, just all by themselves, were the entire size range of all primates put together. All in one island continent, all in Madagascar, is all the diversity of the size that we see in all the rest of primates put together, which means it was one of the more evidence of how amazing Madagascar is as an island.
All right, room 9, you have another question for us?
So it's what do lemurs eat?
Okay, lemurs like to eat all kinds of food. Depending on what kind of lemur you are, it affects what kind of food you like to eat. So if you're a little mouse lemur, you really love bugs. You really love things like worms. You really like anything small, or you like little berries. As we get bigger, animals start to eat more and more fruit. So things like ruffed lemurs really love fruit a lot. And then bigger lemurs tend to like leaves. And so things like shafak, which are the jumping lemurs that look like Zabubafu, or Paleopropithecus was probably a leaf-eating lemur. So bugs, fruit, and leaves are kind of the big things that lemurs like to eat. And they won't say no to anything else that crosses their path. They like to eat all kinds of stuff. Those are the main kind of food categories.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Matt, I think we're going on to the high seas for this question. We've got the SV Skippy hanging out with us here.
Oh, cool.
How are we doing?
Good.
Excellent. I see a question in the chat, but I'm wondering if you have a few for us.
So my question was, do you only study primates or do you also study other mammals?
I study lots of other mammals too. I basically, because we're looking for primate fossils, but we want to find out about the ecosystem that shaped each of these animals. I study like the other creatures as well. My real specialty, I love primates, but I also love carnivore evolution. So in our exhibit, I have this specimen, which is the jaw of an animal called Megistotherium. So this is just the jaw of this thing that is like the size of my head. The rest of this would have been like another 1.5 feet to each side. So it's a giant carnivore called a hyaenodon that would have been about the size of like a giant polar bear. And this is what they look like kind of in life. So they look a lot like kind of a giant wolf, essentially. And so hyaenodonts and other carnivores are another thing that I really specialize in and really love to talk about.
Do you guys have any questions?
Any others?
How do you said the primates were on North America. How did they get to Madagascar?
That is a really important question. So the way that we think they did it, it's really interesting that you're on a boat right now, because that's basically what they did. When we look at an ancient map of the world, Africa was actually an island continent during the time when we think primates got from the northern continents to Africa. So there's ocean in between Europe and Asia, where primates originated, and Africa, where they ultimately really diversify, because then we have to get them down here to eventually get some of them to Madagascar. And so the way we think that they did that was primates love to live near coastal settings, especially in ecosystems called mangroves, plants that have figured out how they can live basically without soil. They grow out into the water column, and they tend to make a lot of fruit. And so primates will climb out there. But then if you have a big storm, a hurricane or a cyclone or a typhoon, it causes a storm surge that pushes up underneath all those plants that are out in the water column and snaps them off. And it drags these huge structures of plants out into the ocean. This is a modern thing that happens. People have observed basically giant rafts that can be like 100 feet long, 150 feet long, drifting after storms. And animals will be kind of trapped on those islands. So we think that primates basically kind of rafted from the northern continents into Africa. And then from Africa, they drift across the Mozambique Channel on rafts to go to Madagascar. And there are primates from mainland Africa that look a lot like some of the earliest South American monkeys. So this is an animal called Parapithecus. And this is basically great-great-great-great-great-grandma to a spider monkey, but it's from Africa, because we had to get primates from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to South America, which is also an island continent. So we think that the way that they did it was on natural boats, essentially. And it sounds kind of far-fetched, but it didn't just happen for primates. It happened for rodents. Rodents kind of like their fossil record there's a group that's from the northern continents that gets into Africa, that then gets to Madagascar and gets to South America. It happens with turtles. This is the skull of a tiny little turtle that's part of a family of turtles. This animal was found in Africa, in the country of Egypt. But its relatives live in Madagascar and South America. And this family is now extinct in Africa. So this turtle, it kind of drifted to Madagascar and South America and then went extinct. And so there's lots of other creatures that are kind of showing us this pattern of rafting from from the northern continents to Africa to places like Madagascar and South America.
All right. Great questions, crew. Thanks for hanging out with us today. Okay, Matt, before we say goodbye, I had one more question come in via the chat. Really enjoying that map you had up on the wall. Is there anywhere someone can chase down that map?
Yes. Basically, any geological map, most of them are available to the public because they were created through public funds. So for the North Carolina one, or for really any state, if you type in geological map North Carolina, you'll often find a link that in the US would be like a .gov. That will be for the Geological Survey, either the State Geological Survey or the National Geological Survey. And you can usually purchase for a couple bucks because they have to print it off and send it to you. Or you might be able to download a PDF of the whole thing and then print it at scale, and then you have to pay for the printing. But at least the file is free. So those are the things that I would suggest, and I can send a link to the North Carolina one if you want to get in contact with me. You can track down my email address at the Lemur Center website.
All right, perfect. Well, to the classrooms tuning in, if you do want to check out some of the living lemurs at the Duke Lemur Center, we often do virtual field trips where we go out into the lemur forest with Megan, who works with the education outreach team. So we did at least one or two before. Now I imagine it's too cold. I think they're probably all
they're all cozy inside.
Yeah. So if you do want to check some of those out, you can find them on our channel on YouTube, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I want to start off with a huge shout out to our classrooms, those who are joining us via YouTube, those hanging out backstage. We can bring them back in if they want to say a big goodbye and thank you, a quick goodbye and thank you. And Matt, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It was great to look at the paleontology side of things, of the work being done at the Duke Lemur Center. It's a pretty cool collection you have. It's pretty special.
Yeah, it's pretty active considering everything's extinct.
All right, great. Well, we're going to sign off for now. Matt, thank you so much. Thank you, classrooms. It's the start of the week, so have a great rest of the week, everyone. See ya.
Enjoy your turkey if you're celebrating.